I was invited by Ruben and Forum Oceano because we have two fields of expertise. One is shipping, the other one is shipping data. So we are trying to combine that. And when we're talking about the protection of the environment, we need to talk about the polluters. And ships are definitely one of the main polluters of the main marine environment. So when we've been invited to present something here, I've asked my team to put something together that might give you a rough idea about what you can do with data today. So 2 years ago, we started to plan a green concept for the ship registry of Madeira. And one of the challenges we faced was that the EU Commission came up and said, you should reduce the emissions by, I think, 55% until 2030 and 90% until 2050. Now, the big question that we were facing was, we don't know, and we didn't know 2 years ago, how many emissions ships under the Portuguese flag are actually emitting. And we were talking to ports, and we figured out that none of the ports, not only Portuguese, but none of the European ports, had actually a clue about how much emissions are emitted by ships in their ports. That's a matter of fact. And when we are starting to talk about strategies, developing strategies, we have here the political leaders and representatives from the mainland, from the government, from the regional government, then I think it is very important that first of all, we need to evaluate and analyze what is the current status quo, how many emissions are actually emitted by ships calling Portuguese waters, sailing in European areas. And then we can develop, based on these analysis, we can then develop strategies of how to reduce the emissions and what measures we have and we want to take to reduce the emissions. Mr. Thompson was talking about a fee, for example, that the shipping companies should pay a fee. I will show it later to you. Basically, I agree to that, or the shipping industry agrees to that. But if we want to reduce the emissions by ships by more than 50% within the next 8 to 9 years, we will not be able to achieve that goal by implementing a fee. The more, and the statistic will show it, I will present that very soon, the most effective measure is actually speed reduction. And I will show you, maybe I can start already. So my team has prepared a presentation about a study that we have done. I will quickly talk about our challenge, which I just already did. I will introduce, quickly say a few words about how we get to this data. We quickly talk about the legislative path of the IMO, why the European Commission and how the European Commission is pushing for results, countable results and achievements. And then what we have done is we have monitored the emissions in Portuguese waters. So we have picked the year 2020 as a sample, and we have monitored all ships' movements within this year in Portuguese territory waters. So first of all, as an example, we have picked all the exclusive economic zones, the 3 zones that Portugal currently has, around the mainland, around the Azores, and around Madeira, and measured within these zones the emissions created by vessels. Then we have looked at the emissions from the macro to the micro. We have looked at the territory waters of Portugal, 20-mile zones. And then we have looked at the, as an example, at the emissions created by ships in the port of Sines. And then I can tell you a little bit what we have in mind for the ship registry of Portugal about the sustainable future, about the green concept. And yes, so GMS, so GMS and Scope Ship Review, these are the data sources. What are they doing? Basically, these companies, GMS is a Madeira-based company, a data company, big data company. They are tracking the ship's position of the world fleet of more than 100, I think it's 105,000 ships, currently over 5,000 tons, every hour. And then these guys are buying the data about the ship's engine size, about the latest and always the actual loading condition of ships. They buy data about the weather conditions of all over the world, and they buy the data of the currents and the conditions of the oceans. And from this information, the algorithms are calculating actually the consumption of each and every vessel. And from these consumptions, you can calculate the emissions of each and every individual vessels. And it takes even into consideration if a ship has a scrubber, if it has an open or closed loop scrubber, and all these other factors that matter. So based on this information, they have developed 3 scores, what they call scores: the environmental, the sustainability, and the reliability score of a vessel. And when we're talking about the environment, it does not only consider a ship, how much CO2 emissions a ship is emitting, it considers also what kind of measures has a company been implemented or not in order to make a ship green. I'll give you one example. Does, for example, the underwater coating of a vessel, is that a silicone paint that is environmental friendly, or is it some kind of chemical paint that is harming the environment? Or does a ship have devices to protect, like noise cancellation system, to protect the underwater life? So all these factors are counted in there, are collected, and then from various factors, one score is created. Why am I talking about scores and reviews? That is a language of rating agencies. So this product is done in cooperation with, is marketed and is overviewed by Europe's biggest credit rating agency called Scope. It's the same like Moody's or Fitch or Standard & Poor's in America. So European Union has the Scope rating agency, and Scope is rating all vessels of the world fleet. So further on, the system is monitoring the annual efficiency ratio, the AER, which banks and insurance companies are very interested in, and the CII rating defined by the IMO, the carbon intensity indicator, and then byproducts are, they're calculating, measuring the emissions of CO2, SOx, NOx, and very important, of particulate matters. Why is it important? Because when we're talking about protecting the environment, we also have to talk about protecting people here. And Madeira, or also Lisbon, is a hub for cruise vessels. And for the people that live here, you don't have a real effect by CO2 that the ships are pumping out in the air, but you do have an extreme negative effect by the particulate matters that these ships are emitting. And these particulate matters are going directly into the lungs of the people that are living around the cruise terminals, right? So it's important to know which ships are green and which ships are not green. So this is just to give you a rough idea about how we measure points, or how the company is measuring the ship's emissions. Let me quickly explain you why Portugal has such important role for monitoring ships' emissions. You will see that Portugal is, okay, skip that. Portugal is based here. These are showing the main shipping routes that merchant ships are using. And you can see that along the mainland of Portugal, there is all the traffic, all the marine traffic from Northern Europe to Asia and back going through. Then through your exclusive economic zone is all the traffic from Asia to South America going. And through the maritime exclusive economic zone of the Azores, all Portuguese, is the whole traffic from and to Asia and the United States going. So you have here in Portugal such important role because most of the world traffic from and to Asia is going through your waters. And this is why shipping, you have such strong shipping activities here in your waters, actually, and you have actually a lot of emissions created in your waters. So this is why it's so important to analyze how much emissions you are actually having here, and then maybe to develop strategies of how to control and even reduce these emissions by merchant ships. So I was talking about speed, right? When we're analyzing the emissions of ships, it is the same like you're packing up your car full with, either you're driving alone at economical speed, or you're making the car full with 4 or 5 persons and put a lot of luggage in it, and then you go full speed on a highway. You will see that the consumption in the later case is probably double or triple the amount that you usually can do. Currently, ships are absolutely loaded full. And because the charter rates are high, they're going usually at full speed. So that means that especially the container vessels of this world fleet are going at high speed and they're emitting a lot of CO2 and other emissions. When we look now at the different kinds of ships, you will see that there are ships transporting huge amounts of cargoes, but they have small engines. Bulk carriers, for example, they go usually at low speeds with small engines. So one can say that bulk carriers in general are more environmental friendly than big container vessels or cruise vessels, because usually these ships are consuming a lot of energy, much more, for transporting a similar amount of cargo. So what I'm saying is we cannot just go there to ships and analyze the whole situation and say everybody has to slow down. You really need to differentiate and to know if a ship has a big engine or a small engine and what actually impact that engine has on the consumption, on the emission of every vessel. Since we were talking here about the environmental zones of Madeira and the Azores and the mainland, I asked my team to give me it's a very precise overview about the emissions that have been created by ships in the Portuguese exclusive economic zone. And you see it's roughly 6.4 million tons of CO2 emitted in your waters in the year of 2020. Just to give you a perspective what that means, in the year 2020, we had COVID, full COVID time. So the Portuguese general CO2 emissions of the whole country was clearly below of the general one. So I think from the statistic I've read is Portugal was in 2020 emitting around 40 to 45 million tons of CO2, whereas in a normal year you would between 55 and 60 million tons of CO2 emitting. If you look at these numbers, you will see that what ships are making in your waters is approximately 10% of the CO2 emissions of your whole country. So this is the exclusive economic zone of Madeira, and it's just to show you, visualize a bit the positions of shipping routes that we are tracking. This is from one day, just to give you an idea where ships are passing by. Usually, and ships usually take always the same routes, because if they are on the way to the United States, everybody is sailing on the same corridor, more or less, right? So this is how it looks like. It goes very much in detail now, because I've asked my team to give you a rough idea about which shipping types are sailing which kind of sailing areas, or let's say which routes, and how much the CO2 for that specific ship type was compared to the sailing distance they have done. So you see here, basically, as what I said at the beginning, container ships are sailing most of the shipping routes through Portuguese waters, and for sure they are the biggest CO2 emitters in your water. Passenger ships, surprisingly, are very low. Why was that? Because it's 2020 and almost no passenger ship was sailing. Nowadays, the statistics would look completely different, right? So we can even go down to the specific ship with these data. So I can tell you, or we can analyze which were in 2020 the cleanest vessels, and we can even have a statistic and tell you which were the most polluting vessels in your waters. The most efficient ships, as you can see, here always the name Oldendorf. Why is that? Because Oldendorf Carrier is one of the biggest bulk carrier operators, and they have big ships with very small engines, which makes them very efficient. I can go here to the port of Sines. This is, for example, one of the days that they have tracked the emissions in the port of Sines. And here comes now the interesting part of it. We were talking about the CII, the carbon intensity indicator, which is defined by the IMO. And you see on the part here, the different CII ratings. It is from A to E, and for example, for the months of May 2021, there were 54 ships with a CIA rating in the port of Sines, and 87 and 84 ships with a D and a E rating, which is the most worst rating you can have for ships. Now politics might decide and think about with these data, what can we do in order to improve this situation? How can we get cleaner air in the port of Sines? And you might conclude that ships with a D&E rating would either pay additional fees, environmental surcharges, things like that. Now, we have brought that up to the people running the port of Sines, or people running the port of Les Chaux, or people running the port of Rotterdam, and you always get the same answer. If we are the first ones to implement surcharges, environmental surcharges, we can certainly do that and we would see results, but then business would move to a competing port or competing country. And that is a real problem. So how do you solve that? You would need to go to Brussels and explain these decision makers in Brussels that European-wide, we will need a same strategy and everybody has to comply to that. If we don't do this, it will be very difficult to achieve results. I spare you all these other details. Sustainability. So I've talked about CO2 and emissions in shipping, but being sustainable is much more than just talking about ships' emissions. So what we're going to do is, for the ship registry of Madeira, we plan to be certain front runners. So we have increased now in the last 9 years the fleet from 112 to almost 850 vessels, from 1.9 to more than 30 million tons. Portugal is today the 4th biggest ship registry in Europe, and I think in the next 2 to 3 years we are in the top 3. This is quite remarkable, and we see that there's a very positive feedback from the industry. And for sure, the more criteria we implement, environmental criteria, I would say a little bit less attractive we become. On the other hand, we believe very much in implementing strongly these measures, because when we're discussing the strategy for MAR, we concluded that we don't need another green award for somebody that has a green vessel. No, we need to be very concrete and precise, and we need to look for the next 20, I would say 15 to 20 years of where we want to go with the ship registry. So what we're going to do now is we are not only monitoring and evaluating the emissions for all Portuguese flagged vessels, but we will also come up with a very concrete strategy that we will introduce together with SDM to the regional government and ask them to implement measures for fading out polluting vessels. On top of that, we will come up with a sustainability concept where we will implement steadily a more increasing demand for compliance of shipping companies. So, for example, that could start with from the UN sustainability goals, we will ask shipping companies to fulfill 3 or 4 goals for the time to start, and then we will ask them more and more to fulfill 6 to 9, 12, and further on of these goals. What does that mean in shipping? I can give you an example. We will ask them to provide evidence to the ship registry that they have procedures in place for treating people the same, that they are providing education to the people, that they're paying men and women in the same way, things like that, that you simply should do in the 21st century nowadays. And we will be one of the first registries that is putting these measures or these sustainability goals into practice for the ship registries. So what could be done? We believe that data should be used to analyze further and, based on the facts, develop a national strategy about decarbonization for ships. We would support an initiative in the European Commission for having a similar approach for all European ports to fade out D&E rated vessels from the CII rating in order to have cleaner ships calling European ports. I believe it is a very practical approach to think about establishing green corridors, especially in areas of Portugal, where we know that most of the whole world traffic and all the transported goods of the world are passing through your waters. It would be a smart thing to establish green corridors and establish rules and regulations within these corridors to tell the ship owners, well, you either go You cannot, for example, sail at a certain speed, or we want you to pay a certain surcharge if your ship is polluting our waters, things like that. That is a political decision, not to us. We will implement the green concept for the International Ship Registry of Madeira still this year. SDM and us, we are working on finalizing the concrete terms for that, and then we'll propose these for the regional government to take the decision. And further, we would encourage the political decision makers to further invest and develop in alternative fuels, in building the port infrastructure for providing clean energy, because that is currently one of the biggest problems that ship owners are facing, that if they're in the shore, they would, many of their ships can take already shore-based electricity, but the shores and the ports are not ready for doing that. And even if you have a shore-bound connection here, Madeira would, as all other ports, for example, Hamburg, my hometown, they're struggling a lot now of how to provide enough energy on the point of demand from the shipping industry. That, I give you an example, if 3 cruise vessels are currently in Madeira, and each of them would be plugged in for the shore-based power supply, all the lights in São Martinho would go out. As a matter of fact, right? Because you cannot give the power supply to such big consumers at a time. So the industry needs to develop solutions for these kind of issues. And last but not least, I would say we need to use more data, big data for shipping, for the shipping industry, about analyzing, monitoring, and strategically using this data to reduce the emissions in shipping. Yeah, basically that's it. I know it's a lot of information for 5 or 10 minutes for 5 or 10 minutes speech. I'm very happy to provide you with more information later about that study.
Jörg, thank you very much indeed. I realize we are really short of time, and I want to make sure that we get all the other speakers an opportunity to speak. The decarbonization of shipping does need to proceed much more quickly. I don't think, and Peter, tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think your fee was about the decarbonization of shipping per se, was it? That really should be the task of a carbon price, in my view, or a carbon tax, in my view, which the IMO needs to decide on really quickly. But I see that the intermediate sort of solutions that you're suggesting here make a lot of sense, in particular, potentially for the Selvagens, some sort of green corridor, because quite clearly ships go backwards and forwards across there. Can I thank you very much indeed, Jörg, for that discussion? Thank you.